And here we are. Thank you all for your patience. Robbie had a little technical issue there with glitch we've now sorted out, and we can see his wonderful, handsome face. We're going to talk today about the Dan Duggan case, and we have talked about this before, and I'm sure we will talk about it again before this goes down too much. Dan Duggan is currently inside of a maximum security prison. He has been scheduled for, or not scheduled for, he's been approved for extradition to the United States, where he faces, depending on which media you read, either 60 or 65 years in a federal prison for an offence which in Australia was not an offence until after they decided to do it. So what's the update, Robbie? What's going on now?
Well, the main update is what you've just said. The extradition has been approved. Now, the extradition was actually approved 2 years ago, and then there was a court process, and bizarrely, the court process played out in a local court for such a big issue.
Court, yeah.
That was ridiculous. It was in the magistrate's court, and eventually, early this year, the last time you and I talked about this, Jerry, there was a hearing, and the very highly qualified King's Counsel, top flight lawyer, made the point that there's no way that the magistrate's court can truly have jurisdiction over this. So they basically pulled the case from the magistrate's court, and they left it at the mercy of the Attorney General. And the Attorney General in Australia is Mark Dreyfus, in the Labor government, the Albanese government. And since August, he has had this case to weigh up in the form of a submission from Dan Duggan's legal team, which is led by a top lawyer, Bernard Collaery, who is the former Attorney General of the Australian Capital Territory. So he's no mug as a lawyer. And he made a very comprehensive submission to the Attorney General about the Duggan case, which is a response to the United States government's indictment. And what's happened is, since August, Dreyfus has dragged this out until yesterday. Now, today that we're talking is the 24th of December, so it's Christmas Eve. Yesterday is the day before Christmas Eve. Christmas in Australia is summer. And so it's the summer holiday, start of the summer holiday period. And this was deliberate. And the Duggan team predicted to me he would do this because he first approved the extradition provisionally 2 years ago, also at Christmas time. And it's a devious way to minimize the political blowback for this decision. And so yesterday he shredded the hope of the family who had been lobbying to have their father and husband returned by Christmas, and instead 2 days before Christmas announced under the cover of Christmas that he has approved the extradition. And he didn't give an explanation. He just said he weighed up the submission and he's approved the extradition. So now all we know is that as of anywhere from the 1st of January to the 17th of February, Dan Duggan will be transported to the United States to face trial on these trumped-up charges for which he was indicted back in 2017. And I'm prepared to call them trumped-up charges. I can't sit here and say, hand on heart, I know all the truth about this case, because you could argue, well, it hasn't gone to a trial yet. What I do know, and the reason that me and the Citizens Party has been very vocal in advocating for Dan Duggan, is it's a very thin case, but he'll never get a fair trial in America in the current political climate. That's what I absolutely do know. Because
the same thing was felt about Julian Assange, and there was no way he was going to get a fair trial. And there's another Australian who is fortunately no longer in that position. But isn't there a situation now? I've got legal training. I'm nowhere near the qualifications of people like Bernard Collaery, but I have some legal training. I have an understanding of the law, the basic fundamentals. And there is a situation for extradition where it must be an offence in both countries. Has he been charged, or is he being charged with an offence that is an offence in Australia? Because this seems to me to be a huge stumbling block.
Well, it is. And for that reason, Mark Dreyfus has no justification for making this decision. But, and there's a huge but, bizarrely, Jerry, extradition happens to countries that you have treaties with, extradition treaties. And they're fairly standard treaties with certain differences. But dual criminality, as you've just described, that's like a cornerstone of every extradition treaty, dual criminality. Plus, you have things like if it's a capital crime in a country and the person's in your country and you don't have capital punishment, then you can't extradite. You can have those variations. But things like dual criminality are standard. But in the case of our extradition treaty with the United States, which we agreed to in the 1980s, we agreed to a treaty where the US government does not have to prove dual criminality in order for the extradition to be approved. They don't have to prove it here in Australia.
Okay.
It only has to be proven in the United States once the person is extradited. So the test, the basic test of extradition, is only tested after the extradition, and it's a bizarre feature of our extradition treaty with the United States, which has given Mark Dreyfus the cover to make this decision. That said, I'll go back to my first point. He didn't have to make this decision. He doesn't automatically. He had the authority as the Attorney General to stop to actually weigh it up, and himself, a smart guy, right? He's the Attorney General of Australia. He knows the law, and he knows, okay, it doesn't meet the test of dual criminality. He could make that decision, but instead he has submissively handed Duggan over to the United States.
And this is a good question. What offence has Dan Duggan committed, or is this a national security umbrella that they're grabbing him on?
It's both.
Do we know?
Yeah, it's both. So this is, and we don't have time to go through the whole picture here. But if people do Google searches for Dan Duggan, you'll get a bit of a flavour of this from the basic news reports. But there's what they really want him for.
Yep.
Versus what they've indicted him for.
Right.
Now, what they really want him for is because from 2012 to 2022, he lived in China, and he ran a business in China as a consultant to the airline industry in China. And before he moved to China, he was approached by Australian and US spies who asked him to spy for them in China. And now, I'm not justifying this or not one way or the other, but when he was approached back in 2012, it probably seemed like a more innocent approach than now. When I say he was asked to spy for them, what was put to him was, if you meet a Chinese general, introduce us. We'd like to get to know him. And he got the message that they would like him to be some kind of an intermediary. And as a patriotic Australian who had only just become an Australian, but had been the picture behind you is him, a Top Gun in the US Navy, and not just any Top Gun, with an honourable discharge, glowing references from his commanding officer who described him as a loyal patriot to the United States. He initially had agreed, but that relationship went very sour after a few years for a few different reasons. And one of the reasons was they accused Duggan of not making contact with them, and he was the one in China in the sensitive position, and he thought they would make contact with him. And then a few other things transpired. Dan Duggan eventually revealed all this from prison, and a few other things transpired, and the relationship broke down. And after that, Dan Duggan said, stuff it, I'm not going to do this. And it was only after that he was indicted in 2017 in the United States. Clearly, and by 2017, of course, the people who had come to power in government in America, led by the Mike Pompeo gang of the Trump administration, who are utterly committed to provoking a war with China, because they believe that they should rule the world and China's rise must be stopped. And so they started making all these changes, and Duggan was someone they targeted to be scapegoated. but clearly because of this murky side of his relationship with the Australian and US spies. But they can't turn that into an indictment. So what they did is they cobbled together an indictment based on what he had done previously in 2012 and slightly earlier, when he had gone to South Africa for a brief period as a test flight trainer for pilots that included Chinese pilots. And so they charged him with breaking the US law, which is the prohibition on international trading in arms regulations, conspiracy. So they charged him with breaking that law, with conspiring to break that law, and with money laundering as a result of breaking that law. And the third one was pretty basic. It just means the money he was paid, 180,000 US dollars, he transferred back to Australia and he paid Australian tax on that money. And that act of transferring to Australia, they called money laundering. And of course, the conspiracy charge is just a way to add extra charges on. And the actual breach of the international traffic in arms regulations charge. So there's just 3 charges. That's the one that is not a crime in Australia. That's the one that doesn't pass none of them pass the money laundering isn't a crime in Australia, but it all relates to this first charge. It's not a crime in Australia because we don't have that kind of law, right?
Well, how can it possibly be a crime anywhere in the world to get paid a salary and then transfer it to your home country, because Australia is his home country, and then pay taxes on it because you've got to? How is that money laundering? How is that possible?
Look, there's a really important book people can read if you want a flavor of how the US Department of Justice operates. It's called The American Trap by Frederick Pierucci. And he was a French executive who got who got arrested unexpectedly in the United States. And the US government held him hostage until France agreed to sell to General Electric, France's champion industrial company, Alstom. And it was just a pure kidnapping exercise and holding this guy for ransom. But in the way the US, the damn Americans always ridicule any country where, China has a 90% conviction rate. Well, the US Justice Department has an even higher conviction rate, and hardly any of their cases actually go to jail, because what they do is they add these charges on and they threaten these people with 60-year, 100-year, 150-year convictions unless they agree to a deal that allows them to...
Guilty.
Yeah, it's extortion. It's illegal extortion, and that's how the US system operates. And can I say, Jerry, we now have, this is why I'm really mad at Mark Dreyfus. The world has absolute proof how corrupt the American legal system is, because the 2 current presidents say it is. Donald Trump denounces as corrupt because of what they did to him, that was weaponized against him, and Joe Biden just pardoned his sleazy creep of a son on the same excuse that it's so corrupt. And so that alone should have been enough for Mark Dreyfus to say, well, there's no way that system is going to treat this guy fairly. No way are we going to extradite him to America.
Especially with the anti-China narrative. But maybe that's what it's all about.
100% it's what it's all about. He's a scapegoat, and he's being scapegoated by the system, who are determined to make people like him examples for everybody else, because they want to, just like with the semiconductors and all those things, that they're trying to break off actual economic cooperation between China and the world. And a country like Australia is a key target, because we are on this tightrope where we have this incredibly beneficial economic relationship with China, which makes us so much money. We get so much income as a country from that relationship, but we have this incredibly close subservient political relationship to the United States that we're terrified of breaking from, and that means we are in the middle of, we're the meat and the sandwich in this conflict between China and America that America's driving. And this is a chilling message to Australian business people who may get involved in business with China, and it also just adds to the narrative that China deviously has been trying to corrupt Australians going back to 2012, because these devious Chinese, they've been plotting to take over the world, etc., etc., etc. It's all a pile of garbage.
They've managed to corrupt me entirely, because I am 100% supportive of this dreaded CCP. The Communist Party of China, the CPC, actually does an incredibly good job. And I'm witnessing this and I'm experiencing it and I'm benefiting from it. And so now the bastards have manipulated me into liking them. It's just shocking. George has made a point. It's not a question, it's a statement. Sick of Australia doing every US bidding, which it does seem like they do. And I just want to go back to when you had a little bit of on fire there, Robbie. I'll give you that. It's okay. You're good for it. So you talked about them doing these deals where they get 100% conviction rate. Julian Assange was an example of that. He was not allowed to go free until he had signed an agreement to say he was guilty. So he's got 100%. They got a conviction from him. And that has left him in a position now where, I mean, really, the best thing Trump or Biden or anybody else who gets into that office should do is give him a full presidential pardon, because, again, that was crap. That was a rubbish offense. And really, it was just done to get their conviction rate up.
And look at all the people Biden has pardoned.
Well, he's just 37 people on death row today have had their sentences commuted in order to prevent Donald Trump from boosting the execution rate. Gosh, he's really damaging Trump's future, whatever he's doing.
Well, there's something like 10,000 other people that have been preemptively pardoned and had their sentences commuted. And some are pardoned, some are sentences commuted, and some are preemptively pardoned to stop Trump being able to get at them. And this is just his faction of American politics trying to protect itself from Trump and any reprisals from Trump. And here's an innocent person or an actual hero to the world, Julian Assange, who deserves to be pardoned. And so far, Joe Biden hasn't lifted a finger because, of course, the truth is the American system hates Assange because he unmasked it. And for the same reason, I've got no confidence that the right decision is going to be made for Dan Duggan. But Jerry, this was the responsibility of the Australian government. So here's the thing. I just saw a clip today on X, formerly Twitter, where the new national security advisor to Trump, the man who's going to become the national security advisor, Mike Waltz, I think his name is. He was laying down the law in a not quite as intense way as I just ranted, but sort of similar, saying that if any American ever gets detained by any government overseas, then we're coming after them. We're going to destroy them. We're going to kill them. You know, if you touch an American, you're dead. Right. And this is America's known for this attitude, right? And they borrowed it from Imperial Rome. Every Roman was able to walk every road in the world knowing it's protected by the Roman Empire. And the Americans have adopted this imperial attitude. Well, Australians assume that our government has a variation of that attitude, maybe not as extreme, but our government is there to protect us. And if something, if there's an Australian, there's a naturalized Australian now in China, Heng Yengjin, if I've said that right, who is a former Chinese spy. Actually, this guy has a very murky past. He's a former Chinese spy. He was associated with our spy agency in Australia, and he went back to China strangely, curiously, for whatever reason, despite warnings from both Australia's spy agency and America's spy agencies, and he's been detained in China. And so he's a cause célèbre in Australia about the Chinese, how terrible they're treating this guy. Well, here's an Australian citizen, Dan Duggan, who should never have been in, even if he had to face an extradition process, should never have been in jail for 2 years and 2 months as he was, because he has not broken any Australian law or faced any charges. So he's got a wife and 6 kids, ranging from 20 odd down to 5 or something. And so totally put the family through utter hell for 2 years and 2 months, entirely unnecessarily. And now our government refuses to lift a finger to protect him because, as I said on YouTube today, Australians are not safe because if the country coming after you is the United States, our government won't protect you. And that's what it comes down to. We are so subservient to this country with its crazy politics, with its extremist politicians who, froth at the mouth at the prospect of the next war they're going to cause, etc. They're bigots, they're lunatics half the time. If they came into a pub in Australia, you would kick them out for being utter lunatics. This is the characteristic of American politics, and our country. I mean, we sometimes stop these people from visiting our country on character grounds. We have these strange, quirky laws in Australia to do that, but our government will not lift a finger to protect Australians from this country because of our subservience, and that's why Dan Duggan is a symbol of Australia's lack of sovereignty.
Okay, so let's go back to George's comment here. Why does our government, because I'm an Australian too, why does our government do this? What's the underlying reason? Is it fear? Is it coercion? Is it influence? Is it just that they're part of the American team? Is it hatred of China? What's the reason why the Australian government does the bidding of the American government so easily?
Well, some of this you can only speculate on. So I'm not going to.
Let's speculate on it. Let's gossip away.
Exactly. I'm not going to give you the emphatic answer, but I definitely have a view, and that view is because this. Not to get off on a tangent, but for the same reason the United States claims that it expanded NATO right up to Russia's border because the countries that joined it asked it to. They said, Poland and all those countries wanted to join us. Well, I'll tell you what the similarity with Australia is. Yes, Poland requested, and yes, Australia has this attitude because America's interference in our country knows no bounds. They have infiltrated our politics. In 1990, when the Cold War came down, George H.W. Bush visited Australia, and a top businessman associated with Coca-Cola, his name was Phil Spector. This is the narrative we're supposed to believe. He claimed that he was having nightmares at night that America might cash in on the peace dividend of the end of the Cold War and decide it didn't need to have all its troops in the Pacific anymore and withdraw and save money, i.e. similar to the way Donald Trump talks. And so he claims he lost sleep over that, Jerry. Like who was threatened? Who was a threat to us that this businessman could lose sleep? I think the whole thing's a charade. But people around him and him were part of a conspiracy to go to America and say, please, Mr. America, please protect us. We are so unsafe in this part of the world without your protection. So please come in, take over our politics, station your military here, take control of our resources so that the military use of those resources has priority over everything else. In other words, have a whole list of things that's in America's imperial interest, not national interest, because I do believe that Americans are some of the biggest sufferers of American imperialism, right? Mm-hmm. This is not in America's national interest, but there's an imperial interest that it shares with the bloody Brits on this stuff. And we are a sub-imperial power to this apparatus. One of the agencies is the Five Eyes apparatus, which is where all our spies talk to each other, and frankly are a power above our governments, because no one in our government would ever stand up to ASIO or to this Five Eyes apparatus. No way. They would be too intimidated to. And partly because we have a generation of politicians now that have grown up thinking this is normal, and it's the older generation of politicians, led most vocally by the former Prime Minister Paul Keating, but Malcolm Fraser was one before he died, and I got to know him very well. This older generation of politicians who were never anti-American, they're always pro-American in their own right, but they think this current generation have crossed a line in terms of sovereignty to just hand us all over to the United States. And so, yeah, the narrative is, we need America for our protection, but everything we've given to America serves an imperial interest, which is this neoconservative ideal of of America maintaining its position as the unipolar superpower and feeling it's in its rights to even go to war if necessary to stop that position being challenged. That's what I think controls Australia.
So in the description, I said this has geopolitical and local political ramifications. What do you think is going to happen now to people like Dreyfus, Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese? They're coming up. At best, they're 5 months away from an election. So, I mean, we don't have an election date yet, but it's coming up in the next. Actually, it could be 9 months, but it certainly is going to. The first half of this year.
5 months. No, not 9 months. 5 months.
I
You're right.
believe the latest date can be September because I think
No,
it's 100
no,
days after. No? Okay,
no,
right.
May. It's got to be by May.
Okay. So in May, what's going to happen to them? Speculation again, but
Well, the strange thing is, if this decision with Dan Duggan hadn't happened, and you and I had been chatting, we said, Jerry, let's do a show. We might have done a good news show on the fact that, ironically, also under the cover of Christmas, Albanese's government released a report which is their intention to clip the wings of ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy
yeah, I
Institute.
saw that. Yeah.
And that's undeniably a good thing, because
Yep.
ASPI is funded by the US government, the world's biggest weapons manufacturers, to create these climate of fear about China that has led to what's happened to Dan Duggan. So this is where Albo is acting in our economic interest, because he came to power and said, I want to stabilize relations with China. So he hasn't made them worse, and he's improved the rhetoric. And in terms of just the interaction with China, he's made it better. But in terms of actual policies on the ground, he has continued without hiccup, even more so what Morrison did, allowing America's massive expansion of its military presence in Australia to make Australia a forward base for the war against China that it's planning. So that's the actual reality on the ground. But he's tried to balance it with being not more polite to China in this way. And ASPI was just a joke of an agency, totally without credibility, just out and out propagandists. And so they've done the right thing and said, okay, we're going to clip your wings and reduce your funding. You're going to shut down your Washington office and things like that. But see, that's what happens when you try and please everybody. You end up pissing off everybody.
Pleasing nobody. Right.
Exactly. And so I think Albanese on this issue and many others is going to end up severely punished. And bizarrely, Jerry, he's the only person in history who looks like who is capable of making Peter Dutton electable as Prime Minister.
That actually is an incredibly damning statement. Peter Dutton looks like he might be electable. I view it slightly differently. I think Albanese might keep power, but I think his power will be eroded considerably. And I think you, as the Citizens Party, need to get people into as many seats as you can, because just on the basis of what I'm seeing on my own feedback, your party's getting a lot. I mean, I don't have enough followers to say we're going to help you, but your party's getting a lot of following from my followers. So that's something. You've got a lot of Australians supporting what you do. So you do need to get people out there and standing in the election.
Well,
we're
definitely doing that.
Okay, I'm sure you are. But not just the Citizens Party, all of the minor parties now, I think, stand a better chance as a result of an unelectable Peter Dutton becoming more electable, because Anthony Albanese has achieved literally nothing that he set out to achieve. The housing crisis is still a crisis. The National Commission for Crime has not. I mean, they were going to chase down and root out the corruption in the opposition, and it hasn't done a thing, has it? They were going to get Julian Assange out of prison. It didn't really happen. They did get him out, but it wasn't really them that did it. There was no evidence to suggest that the Australian government, the Australian opposition, when they were in opposition, contributed to that, or very little contribution towards it. What actually have they done? Because you talk about improved the relationship with China. I'm in China and I speak to business people here, and they tell me, no, Australia is not a good place to do business. The Foreign Investment Review Board still knocks back almost every investment. A Chinese person cannot even buy a home in Australia without going through the Foreign Investment Review Board to buy that home. We're talking about a private home. So what's Albanese done?
I don't want to be crude on your channel. Nothing. I was going to use an acronym, SFA, but people can figure out what that means. One of the bizarre things about Albanese is in this mode where things like cost of living are a huge crisis in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
The way they answer that is they don't actually solve anything. Like, for instance, if they actually solved the housing crisis, that would be huge. But instead of just getting in as the government and acting and doing the things that could solve it, which basically means just building a lot of public housing, and that becomes a check on house prices and creates an affordability buffer for everybody. Instead of just doing that, they do this fiddling around the edges because they're trying to please all the different lobby groups, etc. And so what they do is they come out every couple of weeks and they read out the latest statistics, where the statistics are supposed to comfort the average Aussie who's struggling to pay their mortgage and their electricity bill and all those things, that they're actually better off. Oh, electricity prices went up $1,000, but if we hadn't have done this, they would have gone up $1,250. So you should feel better about that. And that doesn't change. That doesn't impress anybody ever. And that's all they can do. Those are the sort of things that they say to point to their record. And that's why they're going to be in trouble.
I saw the most incredible spin a couple of days ago, saying that the Reserve Bank is not going to cut interest rates this side of Christmas. This was a few days ago, and they had planned to before Christmas. The silver lining on this is that your house prices won't reduce if they don't do this. Well, hang on a second. I'm living in my house. I don't care if my house price reduces because I'm living in it. And people who want to buy a house can afford to buy one if the house. Yeah. And this is what the system in China, this housing crash, which I call a controlled demolition, was deliberately done so ordinary people can afford to buy ordinary homes. It has stopped the massive speculation. And this is what Australia has. They're keeping this interest rate high. And while the interest rate is high, they're attracting lots of money from overseas. Interest rate here is less than 2%. I put 100,000 into a bank account, I get less than 2%. I put it into Australia, I get 4 or 3% or whatever it is. I get a lot more for my money in Australia. So that's why they want to keep it high. But they're spinning it so you're better off in your house paying a higher mortgage.
And to be honest, the real reason is Australia's banks, especially the big four banks, are the most exposed to housing in the world. And if house prices did come down, they'd all be in big, big trouble. And by protecting the banks, they're not just they call them Australian banks, but our friend John Lander would be at pains to tell me to always point this out. And if he watches, there's an old timer peace activist, Bevan Ramsden, who also tells me, Robbie, you always point this out. They're majority owned. The big four Australian banks are majority American owned, and so what they're doing by making keeping housing unaffordable in Australia is propping up American investors in Australian banks. That's actually what they're doing, and this is not what they should be doing.
That goes back to what the question was before, the statement before. Why do Australia keep doing this? It's because they are financially, they're militarily, they're politically, and they're economically controlled by American influence. That's the problem.
The heart of the system, the heart of the empire system, and this is why I included the Brits as well, is the economic system. The military serves the economic power. It enforces it, right? It's what the Opium Wars is a model, right?
Well,
they had a trade.
It goes back to the East India Company as well. Exactly. They had their own army.
Exactly, that's what it is. And they had a trade with China of opium, which the Chinese sovereignly decided we don't want this because it's destroying us. And then the military came in to enforce the economic power, right? And that's the system. And what happened, and in the West, that system is centered in Wall Street and London. The City of London is an even bigger financial center than Wall Street. And these are the two owners of Australia. These are our dual shareholders. Right, the British and the Americans. The Americans are the biggest foreign investor, and the British are the second biggest foreign investor. And our biggest customer by far is way down on the list of about 11th or something when it comes to foreign investors. Belgium and Luxembourg, and these countries, tiny European countries, are bigger foreign investors in Australia than China is. But
China wants to be.
Well, it would invest in any number of things, but every time it does, it gets demonized. And so it's the only country where its investment has to be vetted by ASIO. And ASIO is Five Eyes, part of this Five Eyes apparatus, which is determined to isolate China. And it's a futile thing. It's not going to happen. China is more essential to the whole world than Australia is. and the Americans are in nowadays, right? They've only got their dollar reserve currency. That's it, which they are prepared to enforce militarily. But in terms of the actual essential economy, it's China. And but these American fantasists and their stupid Australian stooges think that we can isolate China, etc., and that'll somehow will maintain our position. And it's not going to happen. But that's the driver, and the power is, yes, economic. And I'm in hand-to-hand combat with these banks all the time, because our party is leading the fight to bring back a public bank, which is a truly sovereign bank owned by the people of Australia through the government. And of course, the number one lobby that is trying to block that is the private banks. But we're recruiting enormous public support for what we're doing, because people want what we're saying should be done in the form of a public bank, and which we recommend should operate through post offices. But that's what we come up with. We come up against this dynamic where this financial control over Parliament is always what's blocking real progress. And it's the financial coupled with the geopolitical, which defines the problems facing Australia.
Okay, so let's go back to what can we do now, people who are viewing this, people who watch this, and is there any further steps that can help Dan Duggan? Is there an appeal against this, or is this just it, and that's all he's got now? What's the situation now for Dan and his wife and his 6 children?
The situation is very bleak, and partly because the fact they did it this time of year also reduced the possibility of a last-ditch injunction being successful or anything like that.
Because the courts are all closed.
The courts are all closed. This was all done strategically, right? So there's very little that we can actually do. However, there is a few things. So for the last few weeks, actually, we have been telling people, because the Duggan team was saying, look, we fear that a decision could be made under cover of Christmas. So we were blowing the whistle on that and telling people, call Albanese's office, call Mark Dreyfus's office, and give them what for. There's no point calling them, but people could still email those offices, and I can provide you the details to put below, Jerry, where people can do that. And I do recommend people do that, so they get a withering blast of anger from the public saying you have betrayed us. You cannot be trusted. And there is a slight chance that, let me just explain this. Because the Attorney General, under the law, in the way the legislation written, he is the person with the power to make this decision. But he's part of a cabinet. There's the slightest chance, and I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it, but there's a slightest chance that if Albanese sniffs in the next few weeks, the next week or so, that people are really angry about this, he could overrule him, because he is the Prime Minister after all. So it's worth doing. It really is worth doing. But the other thing people can do, and however people are capable of doing it, the family really do need financial support. Because remember, I've told you this story before. They didn't want to ask the public for financial help to do this. They
tried to sell their house, didn't they?
They tried to sell their house. They would have had $4.2 million to fund a legal war chest to defend Dan, their husband and father. And it was Safrine's property. It was her own property. And it was $4.2 million may sound a lot to people who are in different parts of the world, but by Australian property standards, New South Wales property standards, it was just a rural property in the Southern Highlands. And the Americans froze it at the last moment under proceeds of crime, even though the proceeds of crime could only possibly relate to the $180,000 US that he'd earned. And so the family offered to quarantine $180,000 US of the proceeds so they could use the rest. But no, this US machine was they're so mean and mean-spirited, they could not even allow the family a legal level playing field to take them on. They're insisting on tying their hand behind their back. So the family's been relying on donations. And the lawyers, led by Bernard Collaery, in the past I've made the mistake of saying that they're working pro bono. They're working pro bono in practice because they haven't been paid. They do hope to be paid, But they have suspended that because they knew that the work was most important, right? So, but now the family have no choice. They got to segue into, and they've already started having to fund American lawyers to do the initial legal legwork. Now it's if this goes ahead in the next few weeks, this is going to be all American lawyers now. It's completely out of Bernard Coleri's hands. The American lawyers are the main game, and they're not going to work for nothing. And so what I'm trying to get Australians to understand is you going to the effort, whether it's a little bit or a lot, to help this family in any way you can. And we can provide the links. There's a legal fighting fund, there's a general fighting fund, and there's this other fund that was helping them raise money before Christmas. Either way, it's going to get to them. There's a website. People can just Google this now if you don't want to look below. It's called just Google Free Dan Duggan, and you will see the different ways that you can make a contribution, and even you can make a direct payment to them through their bank account if you'd prefer to do that and keep it anonymous or whatever. So just Google Free Dan Duggan. You'll see the details there. But like I said, what we're sending a message to the government is you are there to protect us, and you are not to make an exception for one country and say to one country in the world, you come after, if you, America, come after our citizens, you can have them. That's the message they're sending with this Dan Duggan thing. And that's why only Australian citizens who actually see it from the standpoint of Australian citizens. And Duggan Dan himself is a naturalized Australian citizen, which means, Jerry, he's as Australian as you, Australian as my father, who was born in England, right? Australian as my grandfather. I hate the idea that people would sneer at my father and grandfather and say, you're not Australians because you weren't born here. Rubbish. Naturalized Australians are people who say, I'm going to adopt this. This is my country. Yeah. They're usually a lot more committed to the country than people who are born here because they don't take it for granted. There's something about being Australian they want to be. So he's fully Australian, but his family is entirely Australian. He married an Australian girl. He's got 6 Australian children, and they are being ripped apart by this. They're going bankrupt. Their kids, the poor little kids, are developing mental health conditions because of what's happened. I mean, they're the children of Tom Cruise, and suddenly their dad is being ripped away from them, treated like an utter criminal, and now going to be taken to the other side of the world. And here's something really disturbing. Because of this, because the Americans decided to include Safrine in it by freezing her property sale, there's now doubt in the Duggan camp whether it's safe for Safrine, if Dan is extradited, to follow him over there to be with him. Because they made her part of the picture, and they could easily turn their legal guns on her as well. If that
effectively she becomes one of these accessories after the fact by trying to support her husband.
Exactly. And they just might use it for leverage because that's the kind of bastards they are. And I can't, I'm not exaggerating this, but like Donald Trump and Joe Biden have told you what bastards the US Department of Justice is. Don't take my word for it, right?
Yep. Yeah, there's 2 presidents telling you that they can't trust their own legal system. One of them because he's a victim of it, the other one because his son is a victim of it. They can't trust their own legal system. I want to just go on before we finish here. I want to go on to one other point. So go to the Free Dan Duggan site. Also go to Declassified Australia, Dan Duggan Declassified Australia. They've done a really interesting report where they talk about the ASIO links and the the US military intelligence links, where Dan was actually not working with them, approached by them, encouraged to go to China and do what he's doing, and now being punished for doing what they encouraged him to do because he didn't overcommit to whatever it was that they wanted him to do when he was in China. And according to him, he was never asked. He was willing, but he was never asked. So there's something very wrong with this whole situation. Now, what I want to do now is just to move on to the implications of this. I'm an Australian citizen. I live in China. I've worked in schools. I've worked in corporations and companies. Now I work sometimes with Chinese media. Am I guilty of the same kinds of thing. Now, have I broken an American law without being aware of it because I'm an Australian or British citizen? I'm both. I live in China, and I know that because there are foreign agents or foreign, what they call as agents of foreign influence. And in America, Scott Ritter has just fallen foul of this. He's an agent of foreign influence. I'm an agent of foreign influence because I just did a video with my local media about old people's homes and how old people are looked after here in China. Now, does that make me an agent of foreign influence? If I set foot back in Australia, based on what's happening to Dan Duggan, and this is why I want to support his case so strongly, am I not likely to be in the same situation? Would I get put into a maximum security prison for 2-3 years and then shipped across to America to face trial for telling you how good China treats its old age pensioners? That's exactly what I'm doing right now.
Well, you can't rule it out. One of the reasons you can't rule it out is because, well, first of all, you're probably in most immediate danger under Australia's foreign interference laws, which we
foreign influence, not foreign interference. They're two different things. Yeah.
Foreign influence laws,
interference is spying. Influence is telling good stories and getting paid for it. So when I work for Chinese media and I get paid for that, then I'm an agent of foreign influence. Now, there is a register that I can go on and sign the register to say, I've done this and I've been paid by the Chinese government, except that is in Australia and I have to have an address in Australia.
We passed those laws in 2018 at ASPI's insistence. ASPI agitated for those laws. So they're already bad enough. But if America has, depending on how the American laws are written, if they have these laws that they've made them broad enough, one of the ways America claims jurisdiction is if anything you've received in any way involved a transaction involving US dollars, they will say they have jurisdiction. If anything you have done that they want to target you for involves even something like sending an email that traveled through US servers, which in the world of the internet is very common, right? They claim jurisdiction, and they can say, just by virtue of that, we have jurisdiction here. We're going to grab this guy, and all they need is a compliant government that will, collaborate with them on doing that. So you can't rule it out. If they want to target someone, they'll find a way to target someone because they believe that they're the imperial power of the world. And there is, the what's her name? Meng Wanzhou?
Meng Wanzhou, yeah.
Yep, the daughter of the founder of Huawei.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. They say, well, we have jurisdiction over her because of, X, Y, Z, etc. And she was a huge target. And of course, that set in train a lot of different things that have made this the tensions between China and the United States much worse. So the people who and the people, Donald Trump has a certain amount of rhetoric, which sometimes it flip-flops. He goes from all sound and fury sometimes, and then the other day he paid this enormous compliment to Xi Jinping. What a great guy he was, very smart, etc. And I don't think
we can fix all the world's problems.
I don't think he's faking, but But the more important, what you got to do is say, okay, whatever his rhetoric is he going to think through enough and follow that up by the appointments that he makes? Because as my friend always says, personnel is policy. And unfortunately, apart from one or two people, every appointment that he's announced so far to his incoming government is awful. And they're universally awful on China. Yeah. And they're going to, I just see them as a group that's going to try and take up where Mike Pompeo left off. And is Donald Trump going to follow through on this collaboration with China idea is just expressed, or is he going to let that happen like he did last time? And any of us could be a target under those circumstances.
It's very interesting to watch Donald Trump. You've got to forget what he says and just watch what he does. And what he's doing so far indicates that what he says, particularly in relation to that speech a few days ago where he said China and America working together can solve all the problems of the world. And he's pretty right, they could.
Yeah. if
certainly
America's
all the
genuine,
economic problems of it. And you know what? If America signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, it would really help America too.
yeah,
I put this
100%.
comment up. This is how I feel, and this, Mike Griffiths has said it makes me so ashamed to admit that I'm an Australian citizen. I'm in China now, and people ask me where I come from when they meet me for the first time, and I'm afraid to say that I'm British, and I'm afraid to say that I'm Australian now. And I wouldn't tell them I'm Canadian or American. Where do I come from? It is quite shameful. And by the way, Mike Griffiths is actually my brother-in-law, and he lives just around the corner. So I thought I'd put his comment up. Hi, Mike. So just in the spirit of openness, I'm telling you that Mike and I, Mike's my second longest friend in China. We've known each other for 12 or 13 years, maybe 15 years, 15 years actually, and he's now married to my wife's sister. So there you go.
Look, the way I look at it is this: don't be ashamed to be an Australian. Be ashamed of the quality of people who have hijacked what it means to be an Australian.
Okay. There's another thing I can add to this, and this is the Chinese cultural way of associating things. I mean, you'll know, everybody is aware that China has this kind of hate relationship with Japan. But if a Japanese person comes here, there is no racism, there's no difficulties. They get on well, they shake hands, they bow to each other, they exchange business cards, and they do all of this, and they do great business together, and people buy Toyotas and Hondas. They're all built here as well. There's massive business interactions between Japan and China. And the Chinese people will quite openly say, oh, I have no problem with Japanese people, I just hate Japan. And the same thing is happening now with America. It's American people are not disliked here. Australian people are definitely not disliked here, but it is a little bit of a shame what our governments do on our behalf when we elect them. And Australian government is currently not doing the right thing by the people of Australia, who can now travel for 30 days into China. And with 30 days, you can go anywhere. 15 days was a bit restricting. It's extended now to 30 days. You want to go see Xinjiang? Go see Xinjiang. You want to go see Tibet? Go see Tibet. You want to do a 2-month holiday? It's even better. You can come down to the Greater Bay Area, cross over the border in Macau, turn around. We call it going around the flagpole. Turn around, go back in, and you've got another 30 days.
Wow.
It's as simple as that. Yeah. So entry from Hong Kong or Macau into China, into China's mainland, is visa-free for Australians for 30 days. And also from the Malaysians. You should do. It's about time.
I've never been.
Didn't you have to stop over in Guangzhou?
I had to stop over in all I remember was it was in the middle of the night, and the seats weren't that comfortable. My kids were sick. No, I didn't do justice. One of the China haters in Australia has nicknamed me Layover because that's all I've done. He claims he knows everything about China, and all I've had is a layover.
That's not Squealer, is it?
No. His name escapes. Someone. You'll recognise him if I remember. Sorry, he's so forgettable. I've forgotten his name temporarily.
I may have deleted him or blocked him anyway.
No. And speaking of Squealer, the scummy little dirtbag from Queensland, he has been on X rejoicing at the extradition of Dan Duggan because he's a totally morally bankrupt weasel, and that's the nature of the people that are on the that are in the camp of the people who want to stoke a war with China in this country. This is because I know we've got to wrap this up. But this is an Australian family, a wonderful Australian family who do not deserve this to happen to them at all. I'd sometimes say, unlike Julian Assange or David McBride, who did really brave things to incur the wrath of the system, Dan Duggan was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he's been caught between tectonic plate shifts. But this is an Australian family that our government should be protecting, and our government is not, because it's of the subservience to the United States. So please, Aussies, get behind this family, support them financially as much as you can. They're going to need it all, and just stick on the story. The media will go silent. we won't go silent. We need to keep shining the light on this. They're an example of what could happen to anybody.
Yeah, because once he leaves Australian shores on his way to America, he's probably not coming back. He's 55, 56 years old now. He's probably not coming back.
Unless they have some one of these extortionate deals to offer him because they want something else out of this case. And I don't know what that would be. They haven't offered it yet. So this could be just a case of making an example of someone, in which case he could be up for a very long sentence. And in that case, no, he won't be coming back.
That's right. And he's got children aged between about 4. I think his youngest one is only 4 and his oldest is 20. Now, he's been in prison for half of that baby's life.
Yeah.
So far. He's been in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison for doing a job that he was trained to do.
Never had a speeding ticket, never broken any Australian laws. And it's just, they could have put an ankle bracelet on him, Jerry. He wasn't going to flee the country. They could have kept him, he could have allowed him to have total access to his family instead of treated him this way. Australia has treated him this way.
And can we just add to this? The reason for this is animosity towards China, not animosity towards Dan Duggan or Dan's family. He is a victim of this, the animosity towards China. And I would go so far as to say that 98% of the animosity towards China is completely, totally, and absolutely meaningless. China is no threat to Australia. It never has been. It never will be. China is Australia's greatest trading partner. China is the reason why Australia is known as the lucky land. China is the reason why Australia has a trade surplus every year. Australia is the only developed country in the world that has a trading surplus with China. Australia needs China. America, for all of those reasons, hates China. And that is why Dan Duggan is in trouble now.
Yep. And it's exactly what Dan's lawyer said in this submission that the Attorney General had to weigh up. It's all about the xenophobia in the US, and they're making an example of this guy. So if you're like us and you see how dangerous this is, because I'll tell you, one of the things that frustrates me, if it ever does come to a war, the day war breaks out, the majority of people will be so terrified. They'll say, well, how could it have come to this? How could it have come to this? Well, the way wars happen is because ordinary people swallow the lies that paved the way to war. And I've learned in my lifetime, especially the 21st century with the Iraq War and all the subsequent wars, and Julian Assange exposed the lies. And so I'm not going to let the same lies turn around and target a new country and tell me the same types of lies and just swallow them. And this time, the new country is the biggest possible target, China. It'll be the most devastating conflict if it ever happens. And the way to stop it, if there's a possible way to stop it, is reject the lies now. And sometimes you can just say, oh, well, what does it do if I just say I don't believe the lies? Well, it doesn't seem to do much. But when you have a case like this that you can get behind, this guy is a symbol of those lies. Dan Duggan is a symbol of those lies. Then you can do something meaningful to help. And it needs to be done now. And it's only Aussie citizens that are going to rally around this guy and his family should do that.
Agreed. So if everybody watching this, please, it's not important to me in terms of monetizing this, but please share this. Yeah. I will be making another donation. I made one a few months ago, and I'll be making another one. So the more monetization I get from this, the happier I'll be, because it will all contribute towards that. I'm not a rich guy. But from my perspective, what we need to see here, this needs to be stopped. Personally, from my perspective, because I think I would be in the same boat as him. And it's the animosity towards the largest trading partner of the world for most countries. As I think Black Sun has just said, China is the largest trading partner to many countries and is so far the most peace-loving trading partner they've ever had. Because when the Brits arrived, they weren't peaceful. Now the Americans are doing it, they're not peaceful. The Dutch weren't, the Spanish weren't. The Portuguese were pretty good. The Portuguese and maybe the Italians too. As they went colonizing, they were not always peaceful. China has never attacked, invaded. It doesn't send military to other countries. We're being told that China is our enemy by people who really are or should be our enemies.
Have a look at Javier Milei's Damascus Road epiphany, the president of Argentina, who came to power with a very severe anti-China prejudice, and then he recently had to swallow his pride and go to China to do a trade deal. And when his friends demanded to know what he'd done to get what he'd given up to get this trade deal with China that Argentina needed, he became the biggest PR booster for China I've ever heard. Suddenly he's sounding very different. He said China didn't demand anything; they just want to do business. That's what the whole world has experienced, and we've been told the opposite. So. Anyway, and Jerry, can I say thank you very much for your support? I've been reaching out to lots of different people for help today to get this message out there, because it's a difficult time of the year. Of course, people are at Christmas, etc., and this is Christmas Eve. But we need to get this message out in any way we can, because we need all the support we can get. So thanks very much for doing that.
And I just wanted to thank Donut for putting this money in here. Donut is a regular contributor to my channel, and thank you very much, Donut. What I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer this straight to the free Dan Duggan. Just go on Google, free Dan Duggan, and you'll get a link to the site. And there are many ways that you can donate. This has got to stop. If he gets into American system, then they're going to need hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've got to get this stopped before he gets into America's system. I'm not sure how that can happen. The best way to get that to happen is to send messages to your local politicians if you're in Australia. If you're not in Australia, send from outside of Australia. Just go online. They all have email addresses. Anthony Albanese, Mark Dreyfus, they all have Australian parliamentary addresses. Send them an email. Let them know. Let them know. And on that happy note, I think we'll probably stop there, because I know that you're actually someone said thank you for inviting Robbie, but actually you asked me if we could do this, so I didn't invite you. You invited yourself to my channel, and you're welcome anytime to do that. But I think as soon as you told me, because I was out last night and all this morning, I didn't see the news that Dan has been approved for extradition. And I think we really, really need to get this sorted out. Please, everybody, wherever you are in the world, write to the Australian Parliament. They're not hard to find.
No. Thanks, Jerry.
Okay. Thank you, Robbie. Thanks, and also everybody else in the audience, thank you very much for watching us. And I do hope that we can prevent this, get this thing, share this as widely as possible. Send links of this to the Australian government. Hopefully someone will see it.
Please. Yes.